With the release of RetroTink 4K, there was definitely a lot of excitement surrounding this device as it had the ability to make retro consoles look better than they ever have before. While many who have been able to get their hands on one believe this device is worth every penny, there is still no getting around the fact that it costs a pretty penny too. With that being said, there are other upscalers on the market that aren't as expensive, and while they may not all be capable of upscaling to 4K, they're still worth considering. For me personally, I haven't really been in the need of one because, as anyone who has kept up with this channel knows, emulation has pretty much become the main way I get my retro gaming fix. But if you watched my video about ROM hacks, then you may have noticed that there was a capture of my actual PlayStation for one of the games I showcased. This capture comes from a device that I've had in my possession for at least 13 years now, and if I'm being honest, it wasn't until just recently that I thought about using it to capture my consoles. At its most basic, the Toshiba D-R410 is a DVD recorder, but it also has the ability to upscale as high as 1080p. It can also be much cheaper than the current upscalers on the market. Hooking this up, and the curiosities of a certain YouTube channel, has inspired me to take a look at this very unlikely upscaler and draw some comparisons to emulation at the same resolution to see just how well this very ancient piece of hardware stands up. Before we get into the comparisons, I do want to talk about the setup for the real hardware capture. The D-R410 has two video inputs, one being composite and the other one being S-video. For the video's output, there's a choice of HDMI or component. My capture card is HDMI, so that is what I used. Composite has been around for a long time and was very much the standard for CRT TVs and VCRs. S-video became more prevalent with the release of DVDs, and new CTR TVs began cropping up with the S-video input around the same time. Both of these inputs are considered standard definition, but as you can see in this comparison, the S-video output has a much sharper image than that of the composite one, making it a preferred choice when using the upscaler. Another option that I had to consider was the RBG range. After reviewing the differences between RBG and YCBCR, I found the RBG with an enhanced RBG range had brighter colors, making it my choice for comparisons with emulation. There was something else that I failed to pay attention to when I initially captured the footage, and that is the fact that the aspect ratio of the upscale is 16:9 and not 4:3, which is what most games supported at the time. Despite there being options for aspect ratio, they don't seem to work with HDMI. Fortunately, I have a TV that can change the aspect ratio, so it's something to keep in mind, but because widescreen doesn't look as good when it's stretched in 16:9, I decided to use Kodi, a media player software, to force 4:3 on all my captures. With that being said, here are my results. Let's start with the PlayStation using DuckStation for emulation. To make a fair comparison, I have not done any additional enhancements, just the upscale itself. In Alundra, one of the first things that was noticeable to me when drawing a comparison was the difference in brightness, with DuckStation having a much brighter color palette compared to DR410. When it comes to texture filtering with emulation, I've always found Nearest Neighbor to be my preferred option, as I feel it gives games very sharp visuals in addition to making the sprites very pronounced. I do have to admit though that the original hardware being upscaled by the DR410 is not half bad. I actually do like how smooth the sprites are being produced on the character. Using the bilinear filter, which aims to deliver a smooth look like this, is often much softer and not as nice to look at in comparison. So 2D doesn't do a bad job, but what about 3D games? For the comparison, I decided to go with Medal of Honor Underground. It's obvious that things are much more pronounced when it comes to emulation, and like before, colors are brighter, but I found there was actually one thing I felt the original hardware did better. As some of you may already know, many of the 5th generation 3D games use dithering. This technique intentionally adds visual noise with aim of highlighting distinct colors and shading. Personally, I wasn't a big fan of dithering, but after viewing this comparison, I can't help but notice how well it blends the scene as a whole together. You can see more detail on the hand of the original as a result. I thought it was very interesting, and it definitely gives me a newfound appreciation for its use. Let's move on to the Sega Saturn, comparing the original hardware with the Yaba Shinshiro RetroArch core for one of my favorite 2D titles, Guardian Heroes. Like with the PlayStation comparison, the emulated version is much brighter than the capture from the DR410. Outside of the difference in brightness, I feel like the details are sharper with the emulation. The DR410 feels much closer to emulation compared to the PlayStation, but things change drastically when I use a certain mechanic synonymous with the game. Guardian Heroes uses a texture scaling technique to give off the illusion of depth, and as you can see here, moving the character onto the second plane of the environment now gives the emulation more detail compared to the DR410. It's really something I didn't even consider, and I found this discovery to be fascinating. For 3D, I went with Virtual Fighter Remix using the Chronos RetroArch core for emulation. In my opinion, this is probably the closest comparison I've seen with the DR410 thus far, though it's still apparent the emulation is still brighter. One thing I held off on pointing out with the DR410 is a noticeable screen shimmering happening on all the captures. I do wonder if it's the S-Video cables I used, as they aren't first party, but it could also have something to do with how the DR410 is dealing with interlacing, something that emulation has long since been able to disable. Overall, the DR410 is not a bad upscaler, and I'm certainly glad that I didn't get rid of it, as it was quite convenient for capturing my consoles and creating these comparisons. I still feel like emulation is going to be the better experience, at least visual-wise. Another thing worth considering is the input delay, but I'm not someone who can determine the differences. Still, I do wonder if the DR410 is adding any input delay when doing the upscale conversion, which is something you should definitely keep in mind. It's certainly nice to know that I have the DR410 available if I ever feel the need to hook up my retro game consoles, and although I'm interested in picking up an upscaler, this will have to do for now. With that being said, this is The Core, your resident entertainment techie, signing out.